Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on the webinar this morning. Hope everybody's having a good start to their day. And my name is Dave Hanley. I'm the Vice President of Business Development for AdvertiseCast, and I just wanted to welcome you to this webinar, Podcast Advertising, Everything You Need to Know. And the reason for this webinar is that we get a lot of people reaching out to us because the space is fairly new and it's not quite mainstream, and companies, both brands and agencies, trying to educate themselves in the space because they're starting to hear a lot of buzz out there in the industry, and they're looking for some information, how they can get involved and how they might be able to leverage it for their own brands or potentially for a client if you're in the agency situation. And so today we're going to go through a brief presentation here, probably 20 minutes or so, and I am going to leave some time at the end for questions. So definitely, if you have something in the meantime, you can feel free to ask a question on the Q&A panel, and then we'll circle back to those at the end of the session. So if you have any issues with technical problems, sound or picture quality, feel free to, again, you can use the chat box here just to engage with our team, and hopefully we can help you out. So just to get started, as I mentioned in the overview to the webinar, this is a space that marketers are really starting to flock to. And a lot of people are asking the question, why? And what we're seeing is there's a lot of buzz, again, in the industry. And in terms of podcast listenership, it is becoming quickly more mainstream. Now, podcasting's been around, believe it or not, for almost 15 years now. But just over the last number of years, we're getting some really, really good growth in terms of listenership. A survey that came out at the beginning of this year pegged it at around 67 million Americans are now regular podcast listeners. And then just below that chart here, you're going to see that year-over-year media spend is expected to double from 2016 to 2017. So definitely some significant growth going on in the industry. Which is fantastic for podcasters and as well for the brands that are trying to leverage podcasts. So the profile of a typical podcast listener is really interesting because it's typically a demographic that a lot of marketers are finding difficult to reach through traditional channels. So a lot of people in this demographic are not listening to radio, not watching TV, or if they are, they're skipping through the commercials or using DVR or watching streaming. And just from a high level, a typical podcast listener, again, with some variances for different shows and different genres, in a survey, 63% of podcast listeners have said they've actually purchased something from hearing it on a podcast. So very highly engaged audience in terms of actual intent when it comes to the brands that are working with podcasts. Typically a higher income bracket, 45% household income over 75K, 16% above 150. So a more affluent listener base on the podcast side of things. Typically also aged 18 to 35. Again, there are certainly some podcasts that would skew older and a few that would skew a little bit younger, but that's kind of the sweet spot for most podcasts in terms of their listening demographic. I'm going to get into a little bit more about demographics in a minute here when we kind of talk about the mechanics of putting a campaign together as well. We get a lot of questions about rates. So where are the rates at in the podcast space right now? We typically say anywhere between $10 and $50 on a CPM basis. And when we talk about CPMs, that's measured on the actual downloads that a podcast episode receives within the first 30 days of publishing that episode. So if you have a show, for example, that has 10,000 reach, that is 10,000 downloads on that individual episode for the first 30 days. Now, one of the nice things about the podcast space as well is that you do get a residual effect on those podcast ad spots as well. So people are listening to those episodes well past the 30-day point, but essentially you're paying for that initial 30-day reach, and anything else is just a little bit of a bonus there. So on the rates as well, certainly there are some that are a little bit lower, more towards the $10 CPM. Some genres just frankly aren't as high in demand. Maybe it's, an unproven show, an up-and-coming podcast, for example. Not that they aren't effective, but perhaps they haven't been, proven in the marketplace quite yet. And there are podcasts that go higher. So, there are some shows that are, 50 plus CPM. We've seen some around, triple digits up in the $100 CPMs. Typically, those are established shows. The very high CPMs are typically on, say, a B2B type of space, where those advertisers are willing to pay a little bit more in terms of an acquisition cost for a new customer. So that's where we're seeing some of those higher CPMs. But essentially, the supply and demand is kind of dictating where those rates are at today. And again, to talk in terms of a little bit on the mechanics, this is for your typical kind of host-read, host-endorsed type of a spot. There is some lower CPM activity going on in the space right now in kind of a programmatic inserted type of approach, but that's something that's just emerging fairly recently. From our perspective, the most effective campaigns are definitely the host-delivered organic type of spots, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit as well, very soon in the presentation today. So the next thing we're going to go through here is, from your perspective, when you are speaking with a client, there are some key things that we typically work with our agency partners on in terms of how do they build a winning campaign. So how do you put something together that's really effective for your brand? And the first thing we always talk about is, from an ad copy perspective, we always talk about talking points as opposed to scripts. So the talking points will let the host kind of take those ad copy points, put them into a really, really nicely crafted message that they feel will resonate really strongly with their audience. Frankly, a script typically comes off being fairly, artificial, and really the organic nature of the podcast space is what's really, really, driven marketers to work with podcasts, and it's really what has made a lot of the campaigns that we've done very, very successful. The second point here is, when you're picking shows, don't necessarily focus too much on the genre of the show. Focus more on the audience demographic out there. So for example, don't necessarily assume that because you're marketing something for small business owners or entrepreneurs, that those people aren't listening to comedy podcasts or sports podcasts. There is a lot of cross-pollination between genres for people that are loyal podcast listeners. So there are certainly a lot of brands who, for example, sell to business owners that are marketing on comedy or sports or other educational type of podcasts. So it's not necessarily you have to go after the business shows to reach a business audience, for example, or vice versa on the consumer side. Third point is here, repetition matters. So sometimes we get somebody coming to kind of dip their toe in the water in the podcast space and they want to pick up, one or two ad spots. There is a lot to be said for repetition. We've actually mapped some campaigns, and typically we recommend that you start with a 4-episode run as a minimum. And we really start to see the results pick up after, say, the second, third, and really go north on the 4th spot. And that's where you really start to see those results, because the repetition in that message really matters, for the audience. And it really starts to sink in as you get further into the campaign there. So that's something definitely kind of a tip there that we give to most of our new advertising clients. And lastly here, if you're not familiar with the podcast space, if you're not a heavy podcast listener, you don't always know what to ask for. So that's where kind of we come in and we recommend that there are certain things that are negotiable when you're working to do a campaign with podcasts. Certain things like definitely ask for links and calls to action within the show notes. Those typically go, on the podcast listening app. They also go on the website of the podcast, wherever that's hosted. Just some additional engagement there in terms of having those links out there and enabling listeners to kind of click through and find your website, because that's typically a lot of the time what's being done on those calls to action is driving to some kind of website. In addition, we always try to incorporate social media as well with these campaigns. So it's quite common for podcasters to have, say, a 50,000 person audience per episode, but they might have 150,000 or well beyond that social media followers. So if you are doing a significant size campaign with those shows, they're very often throwing in social media exposure at no additional cost or very minimal cost. So that's something that we always recommend. And again, those are some things that just from being in the space, that's the expertise that our team brings to the table. So from a mechanics perspective, what we have at AdvertiseCast is kind of a two-pronged approach to podcast advertising. One being a platform that actually automates the whole process from start to finish. So what we've actually built is essentially a platform that allows you to execute on a host-delivered podcast advertising campaign, but almost in a manner that's as easy as like a programmatic buy, a very simple process. And so it starts with, obviously you need to sign up for an account with us. You can select your shows, and there's several filters you can use, genre, and then some demographic filters like age, gender, education, income. There's also interests and tags that the shows can set up to make it easy to find, podcasts that are relevant to what it is that you're looking to promote. And then lastly, you initiate the campaign, whether it's with one show or 50 shows, that essentially sends out that order to all of those podcasters. And then the platform helps you manage that campaign after the orders get accepted. Through these types of tools, collaboration, so communication back and forth, providing talking points, providing promo codes, anything that you need to do can all be done through the platform. And lastly, on the back end, when a podcast delivers those ads, they post the air checks on the AdvertiseCast platform. Very simply, they're all queued up. You can go and listen to them and check out those spots once they're completed. We also handle all the payments. So it's just a very, very simplified process. For companies that are working directly with podcasts, they could attest to some of the challenges of working with podcasters. Some of them, frankly, are very professional, but some of them are kind of doing it as a hobby. And it's very common to see a pretty developed, pretty well-established show that might have 100,000 listeners. It's a side project. So the communication can sometimes be challenging, and that's where a platform like ours really comes into play and helps streamline the workflow. Now, certainly we've got a platform to do this, but the other thing we have is a team here to help our brand and agency partners really execute effective campaigns. And we can be reached at the the number here, or just through our website as well. So keep that in mind. If you're an agency that's looking to get into the space, you don't necessarily have to build out that capability internally. We can definitely help with that. What I wanted to actually quickly get into here, and the benefit of this platform that I'm doing the webinar on, is that I can share audio. We've talked a couple times here about the organic nature of the podcast ads, and I wanted to play a quick sample here from one of the shows that's in our network, just to give you an idea of the organic nature of some of these ad spots and how they can be incorporated kind of into the show in a way that's going to be very compelling for the audience. So again, this is based on specific talking points that are provided by the advertiser and then executed in this type of manner by the podcaster. So I'm just going to play this real quick. Hopefully everybody can hear it.
Today's episode of the podcast is brought to you by lastnightsgame.com. It's a site for people that are like me who want to know what the heck is going on in the sports world, but maybe aren't watching ESPN all the time, and they have a brother, my bro host over here, who constantly is schooling me in sports, but then randomly I will know some stuff, and that's because of lastnightsgame.com. It's really easy to follow. They break it down into different sections, and each article is no more than just a little paragraph, kind of like a blurb, like The Skim, which I'm totally obsessed with. It's just like that, but for sports.
So if you feel like surprising your significant other, letting them know that Justin Thomas just won his first PGA championship.
Ooh, I knew that because of lastnightsgame.com.
And you can get more of that information by subscribing to The Rundown on Last Night's Game's free tri-weekly publication for simple breakdown of current happenings in the sports world.
There you go. And to find out more, head over to lastnightsgame.com.
So that's a real quick example there. But we've actually got some other great examples in this deck that we usually pass out to people. And what's interesting is that it's quite common if somebody really, really likes the product that they're promoting, like this middle example here I have, it's a show all about saving money, for example. And there's a company called swap.com, which is an online retailer that's actually a consignment store. And this ad spot, I'm not going to play it because it goes a little long. He actually talks about the product for about 3 minutes, although the advertiser actually only purchased a 60-second spot. So that happens quite often, that the host just kind of starts going on and on about the product because they really believe in it and they have some personal experience. And it just really, really drives some great results for our advertisers. So in terms of the different genres, here's a few kind of examples of pretty popular segments within our show selection. Business is very popular for kind of B2B type of brands. Society and culture is very popular. Comedy, sports, and then there's about 15 different categories that are typically standard in the podcast world. But these range from, kind of very mainstream topics like politics and news and sports all the way to very, very obscure topics. I think the one I heard, which was the most interesting, was an ostrich breeders podcast. So very, very specific, very niche. So obviously that would limit their, potential great advertising partners, but the ones who do have a need to reach that audience can do so very effectively. And the last thing I want to do here first is just obviously thank everybody for coming to the session today. And I do want to take some questions from the attendees. So let's just go ahead and get started there. Okay, so we do have a question here on brand safety. So Steve's asking here, how do we ensure brand safety in the podcast space? So this is definitely something that comes up from time to time. What you'll see, I think, if you look around at the podcast space today is that a lot of the early adopter brands are very scrappy marketers, and they're not overly concerned necessarily with the content. They're really looking for that engagement from the audience. But that is changing. More mainstream brands are coming into the space, and this is becoming a topic that's kind of top of mind. The one thing that we suggest around brand safety is if it is a concern, you can request of the podcaster to do a pre-publish air check so that before that episode actually goes out and goes live, you have a chance to review that spot and that episode to make sure that you're good to go with the content in there. So that's definitely something that is doable, and the podcasters are definitely willing to work with brands to be able to accommodate that. So let's have a look here. Other questions. There's a question here on measuring results and how effective have these types of campaigns been in the past. I think what's interesting with the podcast space is that because, again, it's not quite yet mainstream, the early adopters are your kind of direct response type of advertisers. And obviously those types of companies are extremely results driven. So, put in $1 and get out $1 multiplied by something. And that's how they're measuring success. So what you'll see, again, if you are a podcast listener, it's very common to hear a call to action that includes a specific vanity URL or landing page specific to that podcast. It's also very common to hear a promo code specific to that podcast. And that's the way that those campaigns have been measured. Again, the direct response advertisers have, continued to invest fairly heavily, in the space. There are some that are, kind of staples out there that you hear on many, many shows, and they're doing so because it's been really effective for them in driving new customers and obviously brand awareness as well. So we do see that shifting also, more away from the direct response and towards brand awareness. But again, that's something that's, continuing to happen. I would say right now, brand awareness campaigns are probably only 10 to 15% of the market, but it's growing. Okay, let's see what else we have in terms of questions here. So we have a question about geo-targeting, and this is something that we actually get asked quite often. So the way that the podcast world looks right now is that we don't have a ton of data on listening behavior. And in particular, a lot of this is due to kind of the black box that is Apple Podcast app. they're actually coming out with more information for marketers, which is going to be fantastic. But for now, the way you can look at it is that about 65 to 70% of actual listens on any given show will happen on the Apple Podcast app. And what that does is it actually leaves the remaining 30+% on other listening apps, of which there are quite a few. Now, some of those smaller apps are able to do geo-targeting, but not in the organic way of delivering an ad like I just showed you there on that Melanie Minot show. It's more of the approach of insertion, typical kind of like traditional radio ad approach. So a pre-roll, an inserted mid-roll, and those can be done on a geo-targeted basis. The issue is if you have a show with 100,000 downloads, you might get a small fraction of that you can actually geo-target. And then again, the ads are not the organic approach that's most effective. So typically today, this space is best for brands that are looking for a national, even international type of a reach. Although, most audiences for podcasts today, specifically in our network, are US or North America. So that is kind of something to note there in terms of geo-targeting. There are some interesting ways that you can reach specific local markets. For example, we represent a network that has sports shows for, every NBA team and every NFL team. And we're actually running some local campaigns with advertisers that are hoping to reach a, St. Louis market or a San Francisco market or something of that nature. So that's another interesting way that, we've kind of dealt with, geo-targeting certain messages to date. Okay, so we're kind of coming up on the end here. Let me try to answer one more question before we kind of wrap up. I did want to keep it to about 25 minutes today. Last question here is around minimum buys and kind of getting started in the space. So in terms of minimum buys, today we don't have minimum buys. Certain networks do, where you have to kind of spend 25 or 50K to kind of dip your toe in the water, which can be a bit challenging. What we do recommend, obviously, is that you do start with, if you're going to go with one show or 5 shows to actually start doing a campaign, at least 4 episodes. I think I mentioned that earlier, 4 episodes per show. And again, the costs range all over the place depending on the size of the various podcasts. So some shows are selling spots for $50. Some are, $20,000 for a spot. So there's that range there. You don't necessarily need to spend a certain budget, but what we recommend typically, if you want to get some, enough traction and enough data to know that this is going to work for a specific brand and this is going to be an effective channel, we typically recommend kind of a starting budget for a pilot of about 5 to 15K. So that's just kind of a rule of thumb, but certainly we can work with, different budgets, and we've done that in the past. So that is all the time we planned for today. Just the last piece here, if anybody has any questions that, we weren't able to address today, or if you're looking for any other information, certainly don't hesitate to reach out to me. There's my information right here on the screen. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day. And thanks again so much for joining us.